As part of our preliminary site works before we demolish these flats. The flats themselves have been standing for some 40 years but are now surplus to requirements. Before we get the go-ahead, we need to make certain checks, which includes checking for bats, and as they're protected by law. We have taken advice from the Scottish Natural Heritage, because as a council, West Dumbartonshire are obliged to take all reasonable steps to make sure the bats aren't harmed during the demolition works. Generation master plans in place already. It's all part of the council's asset management strategy. Various proposals are contained with these master plans, and a decision will be made on the future of Bellsmyre and the future of this site in particular in due course.
So, my name is Stuart Spray and I'm a bat ecologist, and what we're doing today is we're checking these tower blocks for evidence of roosting bat. So there's 4 tower blocks. They're going to be demolished in the near future. So what we're doing is just making sure that there are no roosting bats in the building before they drop it. So the way we're doing that today is we are abseiling off the top of the building with torches and endoscopes, and we are looking for cracks and crevices that bats might be able to get into. And basically anything that your little finger can get into, a bat will be able to get into. And actually it's quite likely that we will find some bats, simply because the habitat around us is fantastic. There's fields, trees, parkland, loads of places for bats to hunt for insects, and you can imagine they'll be out foraging at night, hunting for insects, and then they'll be looking for somewhere to roost during the evening, and they will see these buildings, look for cracks and crevices, and in they go. Now at this time of year, the female bats are all gathered together to give birth to their young, and that's what's known as a maternity roost. So from what we've seen so far, it's unlikely we'll find a maternity roost in one of these structures, but quite likely what we will find is 1 or 2 males. The males at this time of year roost in a different location, totally away from the females, in 1s and 2s, and they may have several roosts that they use during the summer period, and then they come and go as they please to these roosts. They may have a favourite roost which they come back to more often than the others, but we certainly found lots of little cracks and crevices on the building that we've surveyed so far that would have good potential for roosting bats, although we haven't found any evidence of roosting bats yet. So we're looking for the bats themselves, we're looking for droppings, and the droppings look a little bit like mouse droppings, except when you crush them they go to dust. They're made up of crushed insects. And we're looking for sometimes smudging as well. As the bats are going in and out of a roost, they leave smudging. But quite often, when it's just 1 or 2 bats, you don't see any evidence, which is why we're using the endoscopes to probe into the holes to see if we can actually spot the bats themselves. Well, if we would find a bat before the building could be demolished, the council would have to get a licence from Scottish Natural Heritage. Part of that involves writing a mitigation plan, which is basically just a plan to ensure that the bats aren't hurt or damaged during the course of demolishing the building. Now, depending on what you're doing with the building, you'll do it in different ways. But with this one, because they're demolishing the building, they would get the licence, and we would exclude the bats, and then we would put an alternative roost somewhere nearby for the bats to use. So it has to be a like for like, really. So it might be on one of the trees, or it might be on one of the buildings that the council own nearby. And what we would do is we would go back to the roost in 3 or 4 weeks' time. It might be that there are no bats there now. If we saw bats today, they might not be there when we came back in 3 weeks' time, in which case we could just block the hole up, as long as we can see right into the hole, we can see the full extent of the hole. If we can't see the full extent of the hole, or the bats are still there, we would put a one-way device in, which would allow the bats to fly out but not back in. And what we do is we put a plastic tube, floppy plastic tube, into the hole. We block up to the edges of the tube, and then the bats can climb out, but they can't fly back in.